in New York, you are not allowed to own any interest at all in any New York retail cannabis business if you have any economic interest in any non-retail cannabis business anywhere in the world.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Neil Kaufman, managing member of Kaufman McCown. Neil, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Good morning, Brian.
It's good to see you, Neil. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing really good. Really excited to talk to Neil. Really excited to dive into the New York cannabis market. I don't think there's anyone else that is closer to all the regulations than Neil. So I'm excited to get all of his takes and just get a deeper understanding. How are you, Brian?
Yeah, I'm excited. New York is one of those markets where you see what's going on and then you miss a day or two and you realize, hey, maybe I don't understand what's going on. And I think, Neil, from your perspective, we got a lot to talk about. Maybe the first one, most important, is we don't even need to put you on the record, East Coast, West Coast. I think New York is already sold. Kellen didn't even try to put him on the record. And I know, Neil, you're an East Coaster, so we're ready to slap that in. But right off the bat, New York State's cannabis market, Governor Kathy Hochul, overhauling of the program, good or bad for the industry?
Well, I think it remains to be seen because we don't really know yet how she's going to try to revamp the program. Clearly, the program has been troubled. It's made a substantial amount of progress over the last several months, but there are many significant challenges remaining. And you know, the book is only in like chapter 2. We've got a long way to go. And, it's going to be really critical over the next several months to see how the program is changed, the extent to which there are regulatory changes, administrative and bureaucratic changes, in a dream world, statutory changes. All these things, in my view, will be necessary to optimize the program. Look, taking a step back, Brian, New York was like the 22nd or 23rd state to legalize recreational cannabis in this country. And yes, I'm a New Yorker, born and bred, but we've worked all around the country over the last 10 years in the cannabis industry. At one point, we represented 4 of the 5 largest cultivators in California, 3,000 miles away. So we've worked in Colorado a little bit, Kellen. We've seen what's happened in many states for a long time. And it's obvious that virtually every state has struggled with their recreational cannabis rollout. We hoped that having seen 20 some odd states come before it, New York would have learned some of the lessons and crushed it. Unfortunately, that has not been the case for a variety of reasons that we can talk about. It's never too late to get it right. It's too late for some people who have already lost their life savings. And it breaks my heart to see, especially some of the social equity applicants who are the very people that the state elected officials and appointed officials, really, really wanted so badly to help. Those are a lot of the people that have already lost their life savings and seen their dreams go up in smoke, no pun intended. And that's heartbreaking. So it might be too late for some of them, but the sooner we can get this fixed and get it on the right track on an expedited basis, the more we can mitigate that damage and try to bring the New York market into as vibrant a state as possible, as quickly as possible, and allow the New York licensees to generate the generational wealth that the regulators have repeatedly said was the goal of the program.
Just quickly on that, originally as the program was initially intended, did it ever, in your opinion, have a chance to be successful? And if there were challenges earlier on, individuals like yourself who were experienced, were vocal about these type of potential roadblock issues, do you think it was just internal egos, incompetence, unknowns, different perspectives? Like, where did we go wrong to end up where we are today?
So that's a great question and a little bit challenging to answer if you were not occupying the halls of power in Albany for for the several years prior to the adoption of the MRTA. I mean, the original sin here was on some level, I mean, it was political, right? On some level, it was Andrew Cuomo, who was anti-cannabis and just refused to seriously consider legalizing adult use cannabis in New York for years. At some point, he softened that position. He brought in some very well-informed advisors like Norm Birnbaum to help guide the program. And that ran into political conflict with, for lack of a better term, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in the state legislature. When Cuomo hit the political rocks and decided to compromise in order to allow adult use legalization in New York, unfortunately, what came out of that was a statutory structure that I was concerned from the beginning, impeded the viability of the development of the New York market. And by that, I mean the two-tier structure that New York baked into the MRTA, and there's nothing any regulator can do about it because it's statutory. Like I said earlier, we've been in this industry for a long time. The only other state in the country that has adopted this alcohol-like two-tier model for cannabis is the state of Washington. And nobody I know in the cannabis industry has ever been a huge fan of the Washington state market for a variety of reasons. Some of the more successful companies you've seen in Washington have been, the white guys backed by local billionaires, which is the antithesis of what the New York elected officials and regulators said they wanted to see. I think they thought they could manage the creation of a widely fragmented small mom and pop industry, which would benefit the social and equity applicants that they were seeking to favor. And so I don't think anyone quibbles with, the sort of hopes and intentions to help out all the people, or a lot of the people, who were victimized by the war on drugs, which was obviously a travesty. We're all in favor of that. The problem is, in order to help the people that we all wanted to help, you have to start with a strong industry. If you can't accomplish your political and ideological goals in a vacuum. So you have to stand up a vibrant industry first. And I think the fundamental misjudgment that we've seen play out is that by repeatedly prioritizing equity over the industry fundamentals, we've ended up with a crippled industry. And that's not to say, like I said, that the social equity goals are not important and not wonderful. But you can only accomplish the goals when you've got the industry and the money and the funding behind it to support those goals. And it's very difficult to do it in reverse. One of the things that we've observed all around the country is the tremendous difficulty in implementing effective social equity programs in the cannabis industry. We've seen all different models and flavors in all different states and localities. And the reality is, it's a real challenge. I was at a conference, speaking at a conference, for example, I think it was last year, with hundreds of cannabis lawyers from all around the country. And we had a panel about social and equity programs. And I said to the whole room, okay, guys, raise your hand, please. Who can identify what social equity programs have been effective in the cannabis industry? And 0 hands went up. None of us have seen a social equity program that has actually worked, barring just block grants of money to social equity applicants and licensees. It's just extremely difficult. And if you make that your number one priority over all else, including the building of a viable industry, you're just putting yourself behind the 8 ball and making it, you're building an impossible task for yourself. In some of the early conversations that I've had with Tremaine Wright, who, is very smart and has her heart in the right place and has tried to do all the right things, and some of the regulators at OCM, when we discussed some of the practical and logistical challenges to implementing their program, their answer has usually been along the lines of, oh, but if we can do this, it will be so wonderful. Watch us. It'll be great. And yet, I would say yes, if they could have achieved their goals, it would have been wonderful, no doubt. But unfortunately, the practicalities of business have intruded on those dreams, and they've been unsuccessful in accomplishing those goals, at least to date. And look, we're making some progress now, finally, after 3+ years, but clearly the program has been challenged and has more challenges ahead, and I'm sure we'll discuss that further, during our discussion today.
With the social equity, I mean, New York is kind of the capital of free markets, right? And so, from my perspective, when you look at how the social equity program was tried to roll out, it was essentially going directly against this macro philosophical perspective of a free market, everyone gets a free chance. So they're like, yes, these people are disadvantaged because of these laws, but now we're going to try to change capitalism as a whole just for this little situation. And do you think that that kind of was one of the key factors of all of the struggles that this social equity program faced? Because social equity applicants didn't have the same financial capital because they had been disadvantaged. So then if it's not a free market, or if it's a free market, they're already again at a disadvantage from a resource perspective. So like that is a fundamental difference in how we've rolled out capitalism as a whole. Do you think that had anything to do and with all of kind of the infighting politically that led to the unsuccessful implementation of it, I guess?
Well, Kellen, I think you put your finger on the root cause of the structural problem that has hobbled the development of the New York market. Exactly. The two-tier system. And
can you explain the two-tier system,
yes,
just for in case someone?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, for listeners, yeah, for sure.
In New York, like in Washington, and like in no other state, right, there's a strict delineation between retail and the supply side of the industry. And this mirrors the structure of the alcohol industry, where you see all around the country that brewers, distillers, manufacturers of alcohol products are not allowed to own retail liquor stores, right? And we have this in New York also. In some states, they have state-owned retail liquor stores. In other states like New York, there are privately owned liquor stores, but there are no Budweiser liquor stores, right? There are no Gallo Brother wine stores, right? There's a strict prohibition, which we call the two-tier system. If you're involved in the retail side, you cannot be involved in the manufacturing side. And if you're involved in the manufacturing side, you cannot be involved in the retail side. So all of the other states that have legalized adult use cannabis have allowed the free market to varying degrees to shape the development of their cannabis industry. So, example, in California, you can be in any segment of the market you want. And what that does is it allows capitalism to drive the marketplace. And look, we have multiple clients in California who are great cultivators, but they won't touch retail. Or if they have vestigial retail stores, they hate them, right? Because they're fundamentally different businesses. And, if you can grow great weed, it doesn't mean you know how to run a store, and vice versa. Or extract and infuse cannabinoid products. They're different businesses, right? Distribution, it's a different business. Because you're good in one doesn't mean you're good in the other, but you might have an organization that is good at more than one. And some companies have succeeded with vertical integration. The true irony is that when New York adopted its medical marijuana program in 2015, it mandated full vertical integration for all of the initial 5, then 10, then 11 licensed registered organizations. So if you were in the New York medical marijuana market, you were legally required to be fully vertically integrated from seed to retail sale, right? And then when they institute the adult use market, they prohibited vertical integration. So, creating an industry with that type of inherent structural conflict is virtually impossible. And, I think that's what the regulators have been wrestling with for the last 3 years. So no matter how hard they try, no matter how well they mean, right? Like they're swimming against the tide of capitalism because it's just an inherent conflict built into the industry structure that's almost impossible to manage. And so as a result, what did we see? We saw, whereas in most states, the easiest way to satisfy the retail demand for cannabis, which it turns out is relatively inelastic, right? Like there's demand for cannabis when it's legal, there's demand for cannabis when it's illegal, right? And there's demand for cannabis in boom times, there's demand for cannabis in recessions. There's even demand for cannabis during pandemics, right? The demand is fairly inelastic. And it has been for 10,000 years, right? Even during the last 120 years, which is the only time period during which it's been illegal in most of the world. So in New York, we've got 20 million people, we've got probably 10 million of them consume cannabis. I don't know if that's the right number, but a very large percentage. And the way most states, when they have expanded their programs from medical to adult use, have proceeded is the first thing they do is they say, okay, all you medical cannabis companies, you can now sell adult use because they've got the infrastructure, they've got the supply, they've got the stores, and it's the easiest, fastest way to open the marketplace. So what did New York do? New York had these vertically integrated medical marijuana companies, right, that had invested millions and millions of dollars in building their capacity in anticipation of the recreational market opening up, figuring logically that, like most states, New York would open up to their stores first. But because of New York's paranoid fear of this is the New York regulators, not the New York marketplace, as you pointed out, Kellen, right? Because New York is the home of American capitalism, right? But because of this myth that where they thought they could structure the market to create all these little mom and pop retail stores and mom and pop cannabis companies, they thought that the regulators could manage the development of this widely fragmented mom and pop industry. So they were deathly afraid that the big MSOs that own the New York registered organizations would get in early and dominate the market and crowd out all of the mom and pops that they wanted to nurture. And so what did they do? Instead of feeding New York's apparently insatiable demand for cannabis with the most readily available supply, they said, no. You registered organizations, you're not allowed to sell adult use retail for a long, long time. And I think it was 3 years. And when you are, we're going to charge you $5 million per store to allow your medical stores to become dual medical and recreational stores. So if you had 4 stores, you were going to pay $20 million for the privilege of selling retail in New York State, right? So what do you think happens? Surprise, surprise. They file lawsuits. They've invested, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars in building the infrastructure to capitalize on the transition to the adult use market. And these are some of the biggest MSOs, right? They can afford lawyers. So they filed lawsuits. And, there are, a lot of people who think that they also bankrolled some of the other lawsuits, like by the service disabled veterans that froze the card program. And so, voila, the whole New York program is frozen for 6 months, all because at the root of it, the New York statute and regulatory structure was conceived out of the belief that they could manage the development of a fragmented mom and pop industry and prevent capitalism from functioning as it would normally. And, look, I'm not a right-wing nut job, but it's kind of obvious when you look around the world, right? Like the Soviet Union failed, right? Like, we've seen over and over again that, economies are too complicated to be micromanaged by governments, right? And so there was, I think, a little bit of hubris involved, right? They really thought that they could manage this industry, brand new recreational cannabis industry in New York, and create this fragmented market and help all the social equity applicants, and market forces be damned. Well, what happens when you say market forces be damned? You end up with thousands of illegal stores. Those thousands of illegal stores, they weren't there 5 years ago, right? They grew up under this statutory structure. They are the product of this statutory structure because it took so long and the process has been so, derailed in rolling out retail stores. We still only have 120 or so retail stores open in New York. That's not nearly enough to feed the multi-billion-dollar demand. So what happens? The free market steps in and fills that void, meets that demand, which in this case was made even easier by the pre-existence of such a huge black market. So, which was obviously governed by the free market. So it was so easy for them to swoop right in and pick up the slack in demand. So, Kellen, you're absolutely right. It was the unrealistic attempt to impose impractical regulatory structures on the free market that has left New York in the predicament that it is. And just to sort of follow up on the last point that you made, Kellen, even if New York was going to have this two-tier system, they have ample, sufficient regulations that govern and restrict any unfair influence on the retail sector that are already built into the regulations. And so the restrictions on ownership and investment in the New York retail tier of the market, which were imposed, are, in my view, unnecessarily duplicative of the already in place regulations that prohibit the type of predatory conduct that the regulators were so afraid of. And the end result is, like in New York, you are not allowed to own any interest at all in any New York retail cannabis business if you have any economic interest in any non-retail cannabis business anywhere in the world. Like, think how insane that is, right? Over the last 10 years or so, we've seen billions and tens of billions of dollars of capital invested in the cannabis industry because cannabis is a capital-intensive industry. So there are now a lot of cannabis investment funds and family offices and individuals who have invested in various cannabis businesses around the country and around the world. And because the structure of those markets either require or allow for vertical integration, the vast bulk, almost all experienced cannabis investors own some piece of a cannabis business that is involved on the supply side somewhere in the world. And every single one of those investors, the most experienced, the most deep-pocketed people who know the industry, who know how to invest in cannabis, and who would otherwise be willing to invest in the New York retail sector, populated by the very social equity applicants who everyone wants to help, they're prohibited from investing in any of those retail stores. I ran a cannabis capital forum a few months ago, and I moderated the investor panel. Every single one of the investors on the panel said, I would love to invest in New York retail, but I can't because I'm blocked out. I'm not allowed. And to me, that restriction is completely unnecessary. Many, many state regulatory structures rely on the control concept. So if the New York regulators are so concerned about deep-pocketed supply side participants corrupting or unduly influencing the retailers? Well, we have regulations in place that govern that already, and you can have regulations which many states rely on that say, okay, if you own an interest in a New York retail business or if you control a retail business, you cannot also control a New York supply side business, because then you're breaching the whole inviolability of the two-tier structure, which, like I said, I'm not a fan of anyway. But even if you're going to have that structure, that would be the logical line to draw. You can't control a business on both sides of the tier. Fine. We could live with that far better than a complete ban on investment in the retail side by anyone that owns any interest, even a passive, non-controlling, even if it's so much as one share of stock in a public company on the supply side. And that would have significantly mitigated the choking off of the capital that was available to the New York retail tier. So fast forward, what have we seen now after a year or so, with some stops and starts of New York retail licensees out there trying to raise money and build their stores and get open? Well, we're seeing the retailers said to us, well, deal with our two-tier structure, get creative. So people have gotten creative, and we see all kinds of deals with all kinds of structures, including many that I'm sure if the regulators fully understood, they might view as predatory.
Is that the Chicago Atlantic?
You know what? We could talk about the Social Equity Fund and Chicago Atlantic's participation in that separately, because that's, I think, a different discussion. But in general, look, the financial markets drive investment, and no amount of regulatory, diktat is going to force an investor to make investments on terms that are not viable for them, right? Investors owe a fiduciary duty to their limited partners. Their goal is to generate as big of a return as they can on their investment capital. You can't force them into taking minority interests in startup. All right, let me back up. For example, if you're starting a tech company in Silicon Valley and you have no money, but you have some brilliant idea, right? It's not uncommon to do a deal with a venture capitalist, where the venture capitalist takes 80% of your company and funds you, right? In New York, we've got all these retail licensees who, the main qualification for which was that they had been convicted of a cannabis offense. A lot of them have no experience in the cannabis industry. A lot of them don't have a lot of business experience, especially retail. So you had 460 card licensees who fit that category, many of whom did not have money of their own either. So they're looking to find an investor to fund a startup retail business in a brand new industry with a complex regulatory structure. Like, I can't tell you how many investors said to me, well, that's just uninvestable, right? And part of the reason for that was because those card licensees, the just as small people, are legally required to own a majority of the shares and have sole control of that business. So most investors, if they were willing to invest in that kind of highly speculative startup business, would not allow the founder to have unfettered sole control. And they would not restrict themselves to minority in ownership. And so that's where, we had to get creative, and we have gotten creative. But, that created this huge disconnect where investors who were not banned from investing in retail, right? Think about it, 99% of experienced cannabis investors were, but those that weren't, or new investors, and New York is blessed because we've got so many billionaires and millionaires, people who are willing to throw $1 million or $500,000, at their local cannabis dispensary so they can get their free weed and tell all their friends that they own the store down the street, right? Or own a piece of it. We've got a lot of those people, but the terms on which they were being forced to invest were not consistent with the market. So as a result, a lot of these, not all, but look, Some people had money. They were experienced businessmen. They could self-fund. Those are the ones who got open first, right? The nonprofits that funded themselves and the experienced, I hate to put it this way, but like, the wealthy white guys who had gotten busted when they were young, but went on to have successful careers, made a lot of money, right? They were able to open first because they were able to self-fund, right? With a few exceptions, of course. But a lot of the social equity applicants who didn't have the money to self-fund, didn't necessarily have the network of friends and family who could provide this capital for them, a lot of them have struggled mightily. And many of them have been forced to accept deals that, are probably pretty far from what the regulators had hoped for. Now, you could call that predatory, or you could call that just the workings of market forces, depending on your perspective. As a practical matter, it really is. That's the market for financing functioning the way markets do, notwithstanding the attempted regulatory restrictions. Now, the social equity fund, Brian, is sort of a little bit different, but with some common themes, right? So what happened in New York was, even after the statute passed, Governor Cuomo sat on it. He never appointed a cannabis control board. He never got the Office of Cannabis Management up and running. So we had this long extended delay after the statute where nothing happened, right? And then Hochul came in and she appointed a cannabis control board. They started getting the OCM up and running, appointed Chris Alexander, executive director, et cetera. So they wanted to try to catch up for the long delay with all that lost time. And in the meantime, there was this coterie of 200 plus hemp farmers in largely upstate New York that had gotten hemp cultivation licenses in prior years and had been destroyed by the collapse of hemp prices. So they were dying, right? So the elected officials had this brilliant idea, or maybe it was OCM. I'm not sure. They had they had what they thought was this brilliant idea. Let's save the hemp farmers by giving them the first cannabis cultivation licenses. And the hemp farmers went, yeehaw, I'm broke growing my hemp that has gone through this price collapse. Now I can grow weed. I'll sell that at high margins, and that'll be my savior, right? So putting aside the fact that, like, it's not so easy to grow high potency cannabis, especially outdoors, which is where they almost all are. And it's not the same thing growing hemp and cannabis, right? So a lot of these farmers had grown hemp for a year, for 2 years or 3 years. They thought they knew how to grow. Fine. Maybe they didn't know how to grow hemp. Now they had to learn how to grow cannabis. And so they all gladly took their conditional cannabis licenses and they grew their fields of cannabis outdoors. Some of them grew pretty good product. Many of them grew not so great product, which they harvested. And they're like, yeehaw, I've got my harvest. I can sell my cannabis. And they looked up and there were no stores. So there was no place for them to sell their crops. So these poor, distressed hemp farmers were now sitting on hundreds of thousands of pounds of cannabis with no retail outlet for it. So seeing that developing, the regulators said, oh, let's adopt the card program and give licenses. Initially proposed 150 licenses to justice-involved people. We'll kill two birds with one stone, right? We'll be helping out our really most deserving social equity applicants, the people who were actually victimized by the war on drugs, and we'll give them the first retail licenses, and they will provide the outlet to sell at retail all this backlog of cannabis that our poor, distressed hemp farmers have grown and are sitting on, right? Sounded like a great idea. Or at that point, they weren't even sitting on them yet because this was all in real time. Except, of course, there were delays in the program. It was complicated. It was way more complicated than I think people realized. There was a lack of financing for the reasons we discussed.
You had to find a location. You had to build a store.
Right, exactly. You had to do all these things. and you didn't have any money, and the financing was choked off. So they had this other brilliant idea. Aha, let's do it for them. Let's have the government find and build and finance the stores for our card applicants. So look, in theory, that's a wonderful thing, right? So what did they do? They put the New York State Dormitory Authority in charge of finding locations, negotiating leases, and running this social equity fund that was seeded with $50 million of state money. And they were supposed to raise another $150 million of private money to work alongside the $50 million of state capital. And that $200 million would be used to lease the stores, build the stores, and provide turnkey operations to all these inexperienced card operators. And that funding was going to be provided to the cards for 8% interest on a non-recourse basis. So they did not have personal liability to repay those loans. So as soon as I saw the RFP for that social equity fund in its initial incarnation, I said to some of my friends at OCM, guys, like, have you thought this through? Like, I don't see there being any demand in the investment community to invest in a fund that's going to lend money at 8% non-recourse to inexperienced store owners to open a startup retail business in a brand new industry, right? I mean, investors don't like to invest in startups to start with. They like to invest in experienced management teams, and they like to see, some indication of a solid plan to profitability. So I said to them, if you're going to loan this money at 8% non-recourse to inexperienced investors with all these circumstances, you're going to get a pretty substantial default rate. So if you're charging 8% and you have a substantial default rate, what rate of return are investors really going to see on this money compared to if they loaned money to the biggest, most successful MSOs that, those people are paying 20% or more interest on debt, secured debt alone with a much higher return on equity investment. So how are you going to entice investors who might get 20% lending money to Curaleaf or Trulieve or GTI, or even higher returns investing in equity, companies with experienced management teams in established markets that have far less uncertainty? Why are they going to invest in a fund that, if there's no defaults, is going to generate an 8% return, in which there's going to be defaults because it's non-recourse debt? And they were all like, oh, you'll see. It's New York. People are going to want to do it. They're going to want to be in this industry. It's going to be great. Chris Webber is going to raise the money, former NBA star, social equity, blah, 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 blah. Right. I'm like, okay, we'll see. Right. So what happened? Of course, no investor invested any money in that social equity fund. Surprise, surprise, surprise. So the state found itself needing to restructure that fund. And after a long, long delay, Chicago Atlantic, which is, publicly traded, institutional investor, very smart guys, they said, look, we're not going to invest equity in this fund. We will, on terms that make sure we have no risk, lend money to this fund. So they negotiated with New York State a first lien on the New York State cannabis tax revenues as collateral for their loans to the fund. And the interest rates escalated to 12, and now they're sort of in the 15 to 18% range to the ultimate licensee borrowers. And even there, though, during that sort of couple of years that took, DASNY identified, well, first of all, they signed very few leases, but they blocked out many locations that they wanted to lease, but there was no disclosure, no transparency of that. So you had all these card licensees running around New York State trying to find properties, and sometimes they would find a property and secretly DASNY had already locked up or had gotten protection for a location nearby, and so they were blocked out. And they had no way of knowing that until they had already signed leases. And then on top of that, they just had a hearing about this in the legislature the other day. It appears, I mean, the facts are a little murky, but it looks like Dasney marked up the building costs where they would get a contractor to build a store for like $250,000 or $300,000, and they would charge the licensee $1 million or more for the build out. So you had these poor cards who were paying exorbitant amounts for their build out stores at now much higher interest rates. Dasney just completely botched the program. And look, in fairness to OCM, like OCM was frustrated with Dasney from the start. And I think, notwithstanding the recent report that Governor Hochul commissioned from the New York State Office of General Services that torched OCM, a lot of the problems fundamentally with the social equity fund in particular and with the card program stem from Dasney rather than OCM. Not that OCM is completely faultless, but Dasney destroyed that program on so many levels and somehow was not a target of the OGS report. It's a little unfair to OCM, I think. So that's the story of the social equity fund. It was doomed from the start. And now Governor Hochul announced yesterday, according to press reports, that there'll be no more investments from that fund. That fund is dead. By the way, for the record, I was quoted in that article, Brian, that you read as saying I told them this fund was a bad idea. And what I meant by that was not that it was a bad idea to provide financing for social equity applicants. That's a great idea. But what I meant was it was a bad idea to structure that fund the way they structured it because it was built to fail from the beginning.
I think
Thank you for allowing me to
that's where the
that.
context, I think, is so important. And people hear it and they think one thing. So just final question. Do taxpayers bear the brunt of New York's mistakes? And then how would you, Neil, or what do you see as, let's call it 3 logical steps to get New York's cannabis market, let's call it, back on the right track, not headed for the rocks?
Okay, so the 3 things that I would do right now, if I could, that I think would significantly help this marketplace is, number 1, revise the regulations to, as we discussed earlier, prohibit investment in New York retail stores only if you have a controlling interest in a New York supply side business. In the long run, I'd like to see the repeal of the 2-tier structure and allow the free market, Kellen, to, flourish in New York and allow New York State to nurture the building of national champions. Because in this 2-tier structure, we'll never have that. We'll never have national champions growing out of New York. Someday I want to see that, but that requires legislative change. In the meantime, though, we need to relax the TPI regulations so that we can open up the spigot of investment capital for the New York retail side. And we need to build the retail side as quickly as possible. The second thing that we need to do that will greatly facilitate that is, and this also might require statutory change, but much more minor. If it can be done regulatorily, great. We need to get the New York Attorney General to go out and enforce the provisions of the MRTA that prohibit townships and localities from imposing unreasonable zoning restrictions. In many places in the state, especially on Long Island, even in jurisdictions that have opted in, they've imposed, what I would characterize as crazy zoning restrictions. Things like you're not allowed to have a retail store in a retail zoned area. That seems sort of patently unreasonable to me. I don't know. Call me crazy. Restricting cannabis stores to industrial only areas. I think those townships realize that those zoning restrictions will eventually have to go, but they're not removing them until they're made to, and nobody is making them. And there's a mechanism in the statute for the Cannabis Control Board to issue advisory opinions, deeming those restrictions prima facie in violation of the statute that the CCB has been reluctant to start doing. They need to start doing that. And it would be great if we had state funding and manpowering of litigations to get rid of those restrictions. because that is severely impeding the development of the retail market in vast segments of the state. So those are, I think, the two most important things that would jumpstart this marketplace. I mean, we've started to see a little bit more enforcement activity. Like, I don't know whether greater enforcement is ever going to be the solution. It breaks my heart a little to see people selling cannabis getting arrested again. Usually when the legal market flourishes, the black market withers. And eventually the solution to the thousands of black market stores will be the flourishing of the legal market, which is why it's so important to get that retail sector, growing rapidly. So a lot of people would tell you the third thing they should do is shut down all illegal stores. And, I'm okay with that, but I don't think that's the magic answer, because so long as the demand in the marketplace is underserved, there'll be more illegal stores. It's just market forces at work. It'd be much better to swim with the tide than against the tide. Much easier, much more efficient, much less costly to the taxpayers. Do the taxpayers bear the burden? Sure, the taxpayers ultimately bear the burden of, the $50 million that, will probably end up being lost from the social equity fund, and all the lack of tax revenue that the state and localities have failed to collect because we don't have an operational industry for so long. So of course it falls on the taxpayers. And the sooner we can ramp up this industry, the lesser that burden will be. Now, look, I think there are a lot of good people in the Office of Cannabis Management that are working hard, doing the best that they can under the circumstances to try to get the industry expanded. At least we do have 120 something stores now, and more are coming online every week. And so, part of the challenge we also have is, now that the governor has issued her report and chopped Chris Alexander's head off, the OCM is in a little bit of shell shock. And that's not good either. We need to allow them to do whatever they can to get this industry up and running as quickly and as effectively as possible. Let's modify the regulations to make that more doable. And to my friends at OCM, I say, go do it, guys.
I think that is the perfect way to end it. Neil, appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Colin. Been a pleasure with you this morning. Thanks for having me. And, I hope this has been somewhat informative, at least, for your audience.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time, Neil.
Thank you.